At his extradition hearing, reporters noticed something else strange: his demeanor. He smirked occasionally, looked directly at the cameras, and seemed almost curious about the attention. Some speculated that for someone obsessed with criminology, this might have felt like his case study come to life. Only this time, he was the subject. Meanwhile, the victims' families struggled to process the horror. Kaylee's father said in an interview that knowing the suspect studied crime made it even worse. He thought he was smarter than everyone else, he said, but he wasn't. As months went by, the courtroom became the stage for one of the most closely followed trials in America. Every filing, every photograph, every piece of evidence was dissected online. True crime enthusiasts, legal analysts, and social media creators all wanted to understand who Bryan Kohberger really was. When the prosecution revealed the DNA evidence from the knife sheath, the room went silent. The match was exact. Combined with his car, phone data, and surveillance footage, it painted an almost airtight case. Still, Kohberger maintained his innocence. Through his attorney, he said he looked forward to being exonerated. But his behavior behind bars told another story. According to reports from the Latah County Jail, he was kept in isolation for his own safety. Guards described him as polite, quiet, and meticulous. He followed every rule, but he also stared at walls for long periods of time, pacing slowly, like someone lost in thought. He refused to speak about the case. Privately, detectives and psychologists speculated about his motive. Was it power? Obsession? An academic experiment gone horribly wrong? There was no clear connection between him and the victims. They didn't share classes, didn't have mutual friends, and there was no evidence of any direct communication. It seemed random, and that made it even scarier. Prosecutors began preparing for a death penalty case, gathering evidence of aggravating factors: the brutality of the attack, multiple victims, premeditation. But in the summer of 2025, something unexpected happened. Kohberger agreed to plead guilty to all 4 counts of first-degree murder in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table. When he entered the courtroom to change his plea, the families of the victims filled the seats. Some were shaking, some stared at him in silence. When the judge asked if he understood what he was doing, he nodded and said softly, "Yes." It was one of the few times anyone had heard his voice. Then came the sentencing. Each family member stood up, one after another, and spoke directly to him. Kaylee's mother said, "You didn't just kill my daughter. You killed our family's peace." Madison's father said, "You'll never understand the pain you caused." Ethan's mother broke down crying before finishing her statement, "I hope you never see sunlight again." Kohberger sat still, eyes fixed on the table. No emotion, no tears, nothing. When the judge read the sentence, 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, the courtroom was silent. Some cried quietly, some finally exhaled. The judge looked at Kohberger and said, "Your actions took 4 beautiful lives. You will spend the rest of yours behind bars." But even with the sentencing done, there were still unanswered questions. Why those 4 students? Why that house? And why did someone who studied criminology and justice think he could escape it? Some experts suggested it was all about control. Kohberger reportedly struggled with social interactions, and there were stories from his past that hinted at a deep resentment toward people who seemed carefree or happy, especially young women. In high school, classmates said he was bullied, often about his weight. Later, he lost over 100 pounds and became obsessed with discipline, control, and mental strength. That obsession carried into his studies, and perhaps his darkest impulses. Even more disturbing were the patterns investigators later uncovered. On several nights before the murders, Bryan's car had been seen parked near other homes off campus, as if he was watching more than one target. No break-ins ever occurred, but it raised the terrifying possibility that the Idaho house wasn't his first stop. It was simply the one he chose. After the case closed, police released some of his digital history. He had bookmarked Reddit threads about the murders, watched videos analyzing his own case, and followed Facebook groups discussing the investigation. It was as if he was feeding off the chaos he created, and yet he never confessed. Not once. Not to police, not to family, not even during sentencing. He accepted the punishment, but never explained the why. For the families, closure will never truly come. They visit the memorials, they keep their children's memories alive, and they speak out about the importance of safety on college campuses. But the pain lingers. The once peaceful town of Moscow will never feel the same again. What makes this case stand out isn't just its brutality, it's the contrast. A man who spent years studying how crimes are committed and solved, who understood forensics, psychology, and investigation. And yet he left behind a trail of evidence so clear it was as if he wanted to be caught. Some believe that's exactly what he wanted, to prove he was smarter, to outwit investigators, to make his own story infamous. If that was his goal, he failed spectacularly. But in doing so, he became something else entirely, a living contradiction. Because if someone who studied crime as deeply as Bryan Kohberger could still commit one, knowing every possible mistake, every trace of DNA, every move that leads to capture, what does that say about human nature? About the darkness that exists even in those who think they can understand it? The Idaho murders aren't just a story about tragedy. They're a story about obsession, arrogance, and the illusion of control. A reminder that even the people who think they know the rules sometimes are the ones most eager to break them. And though justice has been served, something about this story still feels unfinished. Maybe it's the unanswered motive. Maybe it's the haunting calm of the man behind bars. Or maybe it's the realization that evil can hide in plain sight, behind a student's notebook, a friendly face in class, or a quiet man driving a white Hyundai through the night. After Bryan Kohberger's sentencing, the story didn't fade. It lingered, in the air, in headlines, in every late-night podcast and YouTube video that tried to make sense of it. Because even with him behind bars, something about the entire case still didn't add up. People wanted to know who he really was. Friends, classmates, neighbors, everyone started digging through memories. What they found painted a chilling, complicated picture. He wasn't always the man sitting silent in court. As a kid growing up in Pennsylvania, Bryan was described as intelligent but distant. Some classmates remembered him as quiet and shy. Others said he had a temper. He struggled with social connections, often feeling like an outsider. In high school, he was bullied about his weight, called names, ignored. Then one year, he changed. He lost weight, became disciplined, almost obsessively so. But along with that change came something darker, a sense of superiority, a belief that he was smarter than everyone else. A few old friends said he'd sometimes talk about control. He hated feeling weak, and that word, control, would follow him all the way into his adulthood. In college, he studied psychology, then criminology. He wanted to understand why people commit crimes, but to those who knew him closely, it seemed like he wanted more than just knowledge. He wanted insight into power. What made people capable of violence? What made killers feel in control? His professors at Washington State University described him as brilliant but unnerving. He would sit in class, arms crossed, eyes focused, sometimes debating others aggressively about how criminals think. One professor said he would often speak about how people make mistakes when they commit crimes, almost like he was analyzing flaws in human behavior. Looking back, it felt like foreshadowing. When the police released the timeline of his movements, it showed months of eerie preparation. Late-night drives to Moscow, Idaho. No apparent reason to be there. No friends, no work, no family. Just long, solitary drives through the darkness. And each trip, his phone traced the same path, over and over again, past the victim's neighborhood. Some people say he might have been watching them for weeks. Others think it was random. A moment of compulsion from someone trying to prove something to himself. But what made it so haunting was how ordinary everything seemed from the outside. He attended classes, graded papers as a teaching assistant, went grocery shopping. To his colleagues, he looked like any other grad student. No one imagined he was living with a secret so horrific that the entire country would soon be talking about it. After the arrest, former classmates came forward. One remembered Bryan showing up to class looking exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes, jittery, distracted. Another said he'd started talking less and less. When the murders happened, he stopped making eye contact altogether. One classmate said he'd once described a perfect crime, a scenario where the killer leaves behind no evidence, no motive, and no witnesses. The kind of crime that would confuse investigators for decades. And yet that's exactly where he failed. Because he didn't leave Moscow without a trace, he left behind DNA, a car, digital footprints, and a trail of curiosity that would eventually destroy him.